So there's nothing you can get away with?
Oh no, if an accident happens these days and it is down to human error or human misjudgment, then they will be able to look at this voyage data recorder, pick it apart, and they will soon find out that it was an officer's fault, if it was an officer's fault. Does the captain allow the fire to keep spreading through the ship, or does he take a risk and hope that they're not in there?
That's a huge thing to decide.
The Sail Away Uncensored Cruise Podcast.
Something people don't know about us when we first met was that you actually worked as an officer on a cruise ship. So how did you actually get into that?
So it all stemmed really from a cruise that I did with my grandparents when I was 12. We went on Fred Olsen's Braemar to Norway, and that just lit a fire in me. I thought cruising was the best way to travel, and I then wanted to become a ship's officer. In 2014, I started Warsash Maritime Academy, which is just on the outskirts of Southampton. And the way a cadetship works is you tend to do about 2 years study at an academy or a university in subjects like nautical science or marine operations, and then you do a year's experience at sea. So yeah, that's where I did my training.
So what sort of ships did you actually work on?
So annoyingly, I never really got a cruise ship in the beginning. Some people were really lucky, and I used to feel so frustrated because I'd be at academy and I'd speak to some that were sponsored by Carnival, and they really didn't want to be there. But then I was stuck with freight ferries, so I had sponsorship from sea truck ferries, which tend to operate on the Irish Sea predominantly, and Condor ferries. And then when you and I met, I was obviously with Marella.
And what was it like working at Marella?
Marella is actually a good company to work for. It was definitely the best contracts that I've ever done. There's some cruise lines out there which are very, very strict. Not saying that Marella are not strict or negligent in any way, but I felt from certainly an officer's point of view that it was a much nicer environment to what some cadets and officers had to go through. Marella, as you'll know, they operate older ships. Being ex-Royal Caribbean and Celebrity ships, they are good ships. Their structure is excellent. Thankfully, under Royal Caribbean, Celebrity, and then later on TUI, there's been a lot of investment into the ships. So they've got a bright future, I would say, of more than 15 years, as long as another pandemic doesn't come about.
But something I never asked you in the beginning was Marella your first choice? How did that work? Did you want to work for Marella, or was it a potluck of the cruise line that you was given to eventually go and work for?
I think because I wanted a cadetship with a cruise line and I never really got it, I just wanted to work on a cruise ship. I wasn't particular about what cruise line it was. I just wanted to have that experience of working on a cruise ship and not a ferry. I don't have fond memories of the times that I worked on ferries, but my contract with Marella was definitely the best.
But again, you didn't pick Marella. That was picked for you. How did it work?
So it was done through my sponsorship with Trinity House. I was never actually supposed to join Marella. I was supposed to join Saga on Spirit of Discovery. And this day I was packed, ready to go. I think my mum was coming to pick me up in about an hour's time. And then I got a call from Trinity House saying, sorry, you're not joining Marella now. The situation with COVID-19 is deteriorating by the hour, and we're not sure what's going to happen. If we put you on a ship now, it could be, a year before we get you off. So they cancelled it, and that very night, Boris put us into lockdown, and I was stuck at home until the end of April, when the same agency got back in touch with me and said that a position had come about on Marella, and did I want to join it? And yeah.
So once you finally got a job as an officer and you started working on ships and cruise ships, what was one of the best jobs you did in the beginning?
So, not basing it on my experience, because working with freight ferries, I didn't really go to many places. And then the time I did get a cruise ship, I was anchored off of Portland and Weymouth for 7 months. So I didn't get to see those destinations. But definitely, if you work as an officer in the merchant navy, but definitely on a cruise ship, the destinations that you'll get to visit is definitely the number one perk of the job, I would say. If I was to base that question on my own personal experience, I would say that it's the people that I met. You working in the merchant navy, it doesn't matter what ship you're on. If you work on cargo or ferries or cruise ships, you will meet some of the most interesting people. You'll meet people that come from the other side of the world. They have a completely different background to you, totally different culture, and you find that you're put on a ship with these people and you're able to form friendships and relationships, and really, really good friendships.
So what's the worst thing about being a ship's officer?
Well, I wasn't a fan of the cabins. Some of the worst en-suite accommodation I've ever seen, that's for sure. One thing I really didn't like is the constantly changing crew. Most of the crew that I worked with, as I said, I've had a lot of respect for and I got on with well. But there's always one or two that you just struggle to connect with. And when you, with a land-based job, like as you'll know, when you're starting a new job, the night before you'll probably have a touch of anxiety. You're wondering whether you're going to get on with everyone. You're wondering if you're going to be able to perform all the duties that are expected of you, things like that. And when you're joining a new ship with a new crew, you have all these sort of questions, and it does take you a few days, sometimes a few weeks, to really settle in. Relating to that as well is a change of captain. So each ship you go on, you're going to have to get used to a new captain, and some can be very demanding. They all like things done a different way, even down to, do they prefer to be called captain or sir when you talk to them? So I wasn't really a fan of that particular aspect. Responsibility is a huge impact on an officer, and I didn't mind the responsibility aspect, but I think when you talk to people, when they see an officer on a cruise ship, they just think, oh, they're navigating the ship, something like that. But a ship's officer does way more than navigation. That is only 50-60% of the role. So there's all sorts of duties that they're involved in, and if things go wrong, their head's on the block. There's so much you need to know. So the reason you spend 2 years at academy is because you have to do a load of courses. There's so many exams, everything from celestial navigation through to maritime law. Like, you have to know environmental law inside out, minimum requirements. For example, when a ship gets alongside, one of those officers is going to go down to the gangway, make sure that the gangway is not inclined to an angle greater than 30 degrees, for example. So officers have to do so much. I don't think people, unless they've been in the industry themselves, they actually realise how much responsibility an officer has. But the biggest thing is definitely missing home. And you have to be the right sort of person to do that sort of job. Like, be able to work away 3 to 9 months at a time, depending on what particular sector of the industry you're in. But yeah.
Did you often see people struggle then, being away?
Oh yeah, I mean, when I was at Walsash Maritime Academy, I think by the end of the first year, I think 30 or 40% had dropped out. And those that did make it to the end and qualified as an officer, I would say that 9 in 10 have now left the Merchant Navy.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Wow. People always go on about icebergs being a huge threat while on a cruise ship. But what are some of the other biggest threats that you can experience on a cruise ship, sorry?
People always reference an iceberg because of Titanic, but ship collisions are far more common. I can't remember the last ship that sunk because of hitting an iceberg, but unfortunately ship collisions happen far too often. But most of the time, I'd say 99% of the time, they're caused because the officers are not following the rules. There's a clear set of rules called the coal regs, They are drummed into you as a cadet, and you follow those rules for the rest of your career. And, you know, when these accidents happen, most of the time it is because the ships haven't followed those rules. The company will find out if you have broke the rules or you haven't followed the rules as you should have done. And in my relatively short career in the Merchant Navy, I saw all sorts of breaking of the rules. I'm not saying it happens on cruise ships. I think cruise ships are some of the safest ships at sea, but particularly on ferries and that I'd worked with, like, rules aren't followed.
What kind of rules?
Not the officers that I've worked with, but for example, if you're on a ship as an officer, so for example, a bit like we give way to the right on the road in this country, at sea, you give way to starboard. So if sailing along and then I've got a power-driven vessel on my starboard side, I am the give way vessel. If my radar is telling me that the closest point of approach is too small, etc., then I need to take action, and then I would make a broad manoeuvre to starboard and then pass her stern. But you see it all the time that that's not how it happens. You'll find that people don't follow those sets of rules, and then they wonder how accidents happen. Something that people don't realise is that when you don't follow the rules, if there is an accident, then people will find out about it. The MAIB or whoever will come on board, they will take the vessel's voyage data recorder, or the black box as it's more commonly known, and that will tell them everything. They'll know what buttons were pushed on the equipment, they'll know what range there was on the radar.
So similar to the ones on a plane?
Oh yeah, and all modern bridges now have microphones recording absolutely everything you're saying.
So there's nothing you can get away with?
Oh no. If an accident happens these days and it is down to human error or human misjudgment, then they will be able to look at this voyage data recorder, pick it apart, and they will soon find out that it was an officer's fault, if it was an officer's fault. Wow. The biggest hazard to a ship by far is fire. A fire can spread through the ship at unbelievable speed. And relating to fire, I would say that one of the worst decisions a captain can make is CO2. So if there's an engine room fire, obviously they will evacuate the engine room. And once it's been evacuated, the chief engineer confirms with the bridge that it's been evacuated, and then they can pump CO2 into the space and extinguish the fire within seconds. But the captain has to make a choice. Does he wait for the chief engineer to confirm that everyone's been evacuated? Let's say there's one person that we don't know where they are. Does the captain allow the fire to keep spreading through the ship, or does he take a risk and hope that they're not in there? That's definitely one of the worst situations that a captain can be put in. When on ship, it's so important, not just in terms of navigation, but all safety regulations and rules are followed at all times. Ships are really dangerous places.
So what are some of the other most dangerous jobs you can do on a ship?
So one of the most dangerous jobs on a ship is enclosed space entry. So ships have a variety of different enclosed spaces. So you have void spaces, you have tanks, ballast tanks, freshwater tanks, grey tanks. And when you seal a compartment for a long period of time, obviously the oxygen inside completely depletes. When you have to make entry into an enclosed space, you have to make sure that it's been ventilated for a full 24 hours. The oxygen level has to be checked by either the chief officer or the captain or safety officer on a cruise ship. There's also sorts of rules that need to be followed. So for example, one rule is that there's never just one person in a confined space. There's always 2, 3, 4, whatever. And there's been so many accidents over the years, unfortunately, where people have not followed those rules, and they will go into a confined space. They haven't measured the oxygen level. They've got in there, and within seconds they fall asleep and they're dead. And then another crew member comes along, notices that there's a body in there, they go in, they die. Then another one comes along, and I think we did one case study when I was at Warsash, and there was about 4 people that had died. because they just kept going into this compartment when it was not suitable for anyone to be inside, and 4 people lost their lives.
But what's the importance of a void space, though? Why are they there in the first place?
It's just dead. It's dead places on the ship. It's part of the ship's structure. They help buoyancy. You have to really see them as just like compartments filled with air. But you have to go in them every so often to inspect them so that you can check the condition of the ship's structure from inside the ship. I remember there was one ship I worked on, for example, where we opened up a void space and it was full of water, which is not what you expect from a void space. But it turned out that the freshwater tank directly above it was leaking into the void space. So it's these sort of reasons that you have to do inspections every so often.
What are some of the worst things an officer can do on a ship?
The gravest mistake an officer can make is underestimating the sea. There's no such thing as an unsinkable ship. The sea and the weather has the ability to sink a ship within minutes. It has done on hundreds, if not thousands, of occasions over centuries. During my short time in that career, I saw several examples where there was someone that clearly underestimated what the sea could do. And from my experience, it usually happens with head office. So I worked for this company once, and the pressure that was coming from head office to put on a captain was unbelievable. Like if he had been more weak-willed, I think he could have been pressured into sailing to the next port of call, and the ship could have come into very dangerous territory. So never ever give in to pressure from anyone, never underestimate the sea. It's extremely dangerous. Another thing which is really, really dangerous for an officer to do, and this again, it can be quite common, it shouldn't be, but taking the ship off of the passage plan, off of the route in the passage plan, and going into uncharted waters. And the best example of where that happened was Costa Concordia, because the captain took the ship off of its planned passage, took it into unknown waters, and somehow was navigating a massive cruise ship at night just with his eyes. And you end up with a shipwreck.
Sticking with danger, though, unfortunately people do go overboard on ships and cruise ships. What actually happens on a bridge when that happens for an officer and a captain and everyone else?
So unfortunately, when a man overboard situation happens, most of the time, no one knows where that man overboard is. It's just come as a report that someone's gone missing and we need to find them. So when they don't know the whereabouts of the man overboard, they basically retrace the ship's track. So they'll take into account the wind, the tide, current, and they'll try and estimate where the casualty is likely to be. But most of the time, they rarely find the man overboard alive. In a situation where we know where the man overboard is, so for example, I'm on the bridge, I've heard that there's a man overboard on the starboard side, it's a lot easier for the officer to behave correctly and recover the casualties safely. So as an example, if we had a man overboard on the starboard side, first thing I would do is let go the life buoy on one of the bridge wings, which has a smoke float and a light. I'd probably let go the one on the other side as well, just so there's double the amount of chance for a man overboard to actually get themselves into a life buoy. Then as an officer, you need to carry out a man overboard manoeuvre. There's 2 which are usually used. You've got an Anderson turn and a Williamson turn. I personally prefer a Williamson turn. The point of a man overboard manoeuvre is it serves to turn the ship around in the direction of the man overboard, and it keeps the propellers away from the casualty, because it's not a good idea to run over the man overboard. Whilst doing so, I would ask the junior officer to call the captain, call the engine room, explain what's going on, whilst sounding 3 prolonged blasts on the ship's whistle, which is code Oscar, which is man overboard. During the day, if it was during the day, then we would also hoist flag Oscar, which again, is man overboard, which then tells nearby vessels that we're experiencing a man overboard situation. Extra lookouts would be posted. We would muster rescue crews, and they would prepare the rescue boats for operation. The rescue crew would then rig pilot ladders and safety nets ready to recover the casualty. And then I would broadcast an urgency message over VHF to nearby vessels that we are experiencing a man overboard situation, so that they can keep a sharp lookout for the casualty themselves.
Wow. So how long will that search go on for? Is there unfortunately, a cut-off point for when you would stop?
If we don't know where the casualty is.
Yes.
Yeah, so if we don't know where the casualty is, then it really depends on several factors, one of which is the conditions. So if you're in winter, very rough seas, you're not going to continue the search for too long, because you're not going to be able to survive in the ocean in those sort of temperatures and those sort of conditions. If it's in summer and you're in a warmer climate, then you'd probably do a search and rescue for several hours, but it really does depend on the situation.
So when we started dating, it was during the peak of COVID, the pandemic, and you was working on Marine Explorer, wasn't you? That was right, yeah?
I joined Marella Explorer, which was anchored off of Portland in the south of England.
What was that like, though, during the pandemic? No passengers, hardly any crew?
Boring and soul-destroying is the first things that would come to mind. I was on Marella Explorer for 7 months, and definitely the first few weeks were the toughest. So as soon as I boarded Marella Explorer in Portland, I was taken straight to my cabin. I was given a passenger balcony cabin right next to the bridge, and I was put in there, and I wasn't allowed to leave it for 2 weeks. The only person that I was allowed to see each day for the first 2 weeks was the doctor. The doctor would come to my cabin, take my temperature in the morning and in the evening, and someone would deliver my food on a tray and just leave it outside the door. Thankfully, I had a balcony.
So you didn't get to say what you got delivered? It wasn't like room service?
No, the food was shocking. So in 7 months, I lost 5 stone.
Wow.
So, so I gradually put it back on through different cruises as a passenger, but as a crew member on there, I mean, the food was terrible.
What was they serving you?
I don't even know. I couldn't even describe it. I mean, sometimes they'd deliver a tray and there'd be like carrots and broccoli.
So it was a struggle.
Oh yeah, it was. And the first 6 weeks of that particular trip was really, really hard, because it was during the pandemic. It was still very, very uncertain times. I didn't know how long I was going to be on there for. And yeah.
But what was the crew spirit like at the time? Again, there's nothing for them to do apart from work. There's no crew for them to, any passengers for them to interact with. So,
as I said, that was during the pandemic. It was a very, very odd experience. So that ship usually carries 2,000 passengers, 800 or 900 crew. During the 7 months I was on board, there was never any more than 97 people on board at any one time. So that's a very weird experience. Like, never before or since have I been able to walk the ship's length on the promenade deck without bumping into someone. It's very weird. You can go from the main dining room all the way to the theatre at the front of the ship and not see a single person. So that's really unusual. We were just a ghost ship, really. And we weren't the only ones. I mean, we were anchored next to P&O Britannia, Queen Mary 2, 2 other Marella ships. It was surreal times. I didn't enjoy the first few weeks, but I grew to like it. I think towards the latter part of that contract, I actually didn't mind it. But very, very boring being anchored pretty much in the same place for 7 months. It was a childhood dream to work on a cruise ship and be an officer and one day a captain. But dreams change. I returned home, met you, went to Southampton, finished off my exams, and then never went back. You have to be the right sort of person to work on a ship. And I think I realised over time that I wasn't that person. You need to be able to work away from home and not miss loved ones. Be prepared to miss weddings, birthdays, funerals. I'm still lucky enough to have grandparents, and it often used to go through my mind, like, if anything happened now, I can't be there. And some people are prepared to live with that. And yeah, the money's really good and you get to see the world, you get to work with some fantastic people. But it wasn't for me.
Do you miss being a ship's officer?
I miss navigating a ship, but I don't miss the early starts. I don't miss the working away from home for months on end. Cabins which are inspected every week by your captain or your staff captain, and most of the time they all seem to fail for one thing or another. I think I failed a cabin inspection once because there was some limescale marks on the shower door.
Brutal.
Of my cab. Oh yeah, extreme. I was told off once because I hadn't emptied my bin, but there was just an empty can of Coke in there, and I had to empty it. So yeah, it can be strict. I don't miss those sort of aspects about working at sea, and I certainly don't miss all the other jobs that come with being a ship's officer, like tank inspections and doing drills every week. I don't miss that at all. It wasn't for me, but I'm glad I did it, and I think it gave me a good and a useful perspective to be a cruise influencer, and now more recently the editor-in-chief of the fastest growing cruise magazine in the UK.